and share my desktop. All right, so welcome to class. We got quite a few people up there. Hey, there was a question yesterday, Sarah. Um, there was a question. Some people were looking for jobs. Didn't you say that there was a job that you'd heard about? Did that already get filled?
Yes. So Bloom, which is a company that uses algae to create a certain type of plastic foam, they're based out of Meridian, Mississippi. They're looking for GIS technicians to be able to map out algae blooms throughout the southeast in order for them to better assess what volume of algae they have for their company. So
And
they're looking for GIS technicians.
the name of the company was Bloom?
Bloom Foam.
Bloom
Yes.
Foam? Okay. All right.
Out of Meridian.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm sure we can look it up based on that.
Yeah, sure.
And anyway, all right. So today we're going to talk about a few things. I have to be honest with you here. So today I was going to talk about this concept of classification and accuracy assessment. And like last week's lecture, this is kind of a new new material for this class. So I thought I was going to have a time to make a PowerPoint slide, and PowerPoint slides, and I haven't. So I'm going to talk about this subject, and I'll do some demos, and then I'll prepare some materials for you to look over later, some PowerPoint materials for you to look over later, and then also have some readings. So, but this is a topic that is important, and that's, I guess, I don't know, a hot topic, you might say. So you've probably heard of people talking about things like big data, and people talking about data science, and those are really, really broad terms, and especially data science. And we are living in an age where we get data sets that have, instead of having hundreds of records like a data set of that you might collect for your neighborhood or somewhere there, we have huge data sets, and sometimes it's hard to recognize patterns in the data, and hard to look at. Basically, it's hard to ask it questions. We've actually practiced. You can use structured query language, or you can use something else to ask your database questions, like show me all the records that match this criteria, show me all the records that match that criteria. But in a broad sense, if we just want to start churning through it and asking about general patterns, we have some tools, and we actually have already talked about some of those tools. So we've looked at spatially explicit tools for doing that with the point pattern analysis and the clustering analysis, and we've looked at we talked about regression. Okay, so regression is a mathematical tool that forms actually the basis for lots of some of the other tools that we'll talk about today, and some of the other tools we won't talk about today. But if anybody, thinking back on that lecture, what is the point of regression, or what data do we have to have? What data do we have to start with? We're trying to come up with a mathematical model, and that mathematical model is built from what? How do we create the mathematical model when we do something with traditional regression? How is that model created? We have to have data, is what I'm trying to get at, right? We have to have examples of either a spatial or even an aspatial process. We have to have examples, and the result is that we're trying to predict an output value. So with regression, if you remember, we had one of the first data analysis tools that you can do is to plot how two variables covary with each other. Okay, and we used what kind of plot did we talk about when we did that? Two variables. So we have an x and a y axis. We have a bunch of points.
Okay.
Scatter plot, right? Scatter plot will show us a scatter plot will show us how those two variables are related to each other. And so the mathematical formula that we're creating through doing a regression analysis is going to help us to predict one variable based on the presence of another variable. Okay. And as geographers, we can throw space location into the mix there, and that's what we could do. Now, what if we're not trying to predict a there's a few different places I could have started here, but what if we're not trying to predict a continuous value? Like what were some of the examples that we did in that class? We tried to predict like call volume. Well, that was the lab. Tried to predict call volume, or yeah, from various other variables, population, city distance to city center, things like that. And we were trying to predict call volume, which is a continuous variable. What happens if we were trying to take data that we had, like we have a big data set, and instead of predicting something that is a continuous variable, we were trying to predict a label, in other words, a class. We call that exercise classification. So we have a bunch of data, and we're trying to predict what type of class data. So if we had a bunch of census data, we could that had things like population, age, the number of different racial makeups and male-female relationships and all those things are makeup, and then income and housing information. We could use that sort of information to create a map of categories, if we had the categories. Like, I don't know, what are some socioeconomic categories you might think of?
Like people dealing with housing, or dealing with maybe single versus married, those categories, right?
Yeah.
All the males that 20 years old that is not married, all the females. Because that's in the census data. They break stuff into social. That's based on raw data.
Right. And that's just census data. That's just publicly available data. As you can imagine, there's people, there's information being collected, huge data sets being collected every day from our mobile phone information, from other information that we do, that we submit when we're online. And if you had a data set that had, for example, information about shopping patterns, and you wanted to find out, well, who are the people that are most likely to buy X, maybe in that area.
So is it inference down there? So you want to infer from the data that it could be saying that we have to use particular software to break out from that data what is actually occurring here, or is that what we as geoscientists have to use?
Right. So it's inference data, but instead of inferring a continuous numerical value, we're talking about inferring a categorical variable, a class.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Okay. Now, class of 4 is class of people. A class of 4 is
could be either one. Could be class. It could be any one. The example that I'm going to show right now is a physical variable, but so it could be people or it could be whatever. So the point is here that with big data, typically we're talking about just having rows and columns of data. The rows represent observations, and the columns represent the attributes of that particular class. So, in all cases here, so the general term, and this will be on any slide I create here, in all cases, what we want to have if we're going to do something like this is a data set, whether it's big or small. These tools are particularly useful on large data sets. But what we want to do is have our data, whether it's points, lines, or polygons, in an attribute table where we have attributes in the columns that are going to predict some category or class. And we have to have 3 sets of data. Ideally, we have 3 sets of data. One set of data is what we call the training data set. And in the training data set, you need to have all the same categories that you want to be able to predict. So if you want to be able to predict whether some area is going to be purchasing some product, then you need to have all the variables that you think are going to explain whether or not they would be able to purchase that. Okay. And then you need to have a column in your data, an extra column in this data set that's called the training data set. You need to have an extra column that represents the assigned class for that data. In other words, it could be 5 classes, it could be 6 classes, but it has to be the data that you'll assign. So you'll have the training data set. Okay. Then, in addition to the training data set, you need to have a global data set. And when I say global, I don't mean worldwide. I mean you need to have a data set for which you don't know the answer, and that's the whole purpose of doing this. You need to project the result of your classifier onto the global data set and then classify everything in that data set based on the input data set. Okay. And then finally, ideally, you should have another data set that you call the verification data set. And the verification data set kind of gets into this accuracy assessment stuff. The verification data set is the data set that you know the answers to, and you can take your model and run it on the
ones that you do know.
The ones that you do know, and see if it predicted the right result. You withhold the information from that. Okay.
And I guess when you know it's accurate, because you can't run on everything, you just run on what you know is true. And if your answers come out to match that, then you infer that maybe all the other ones are correct too.
Yep. So, you've probably heard of some lots of different classification techniques, even if you haven't necessarily heard that they're classification techniques. But everybody, like today, people are always talking about machine learning, and so you might have heard that term, or they might have talked about neural networks, right? Deep learning. These are all tools that these are all ways of doing this particular task, classification. They're all algorithms for doing that particular task. So I think that people will be coming up with methods of doing classification until the end of time, right? So most of those guys that are actually coming up with brand new classification techniques are mathematicians and even some geographers, but they also have that skill of being of having a deep understanding of mathematics.
So
okay?
With this classification, I had to do some survey, and then they asked me, is this one a red light? They gave me 5 pictures. Is this a traffic light? Is this a traffic light? I'm looking around and said, well, so 3 pictures had traffic light and the other one had sidewalk. So I picked traffic, and then they had me go to the next one. So what they're doing is, that what you call the training set? They're telling me to select visually was a traffic light.
Yeah.
So that when they compile thousands and thousands of those things, it don't want to take them a second to come up with the correct answer visually for the computer looking at it. So that's a traffic
Yeah,
light.
I mean, I don't know exactly the situation that the background to the situation that you're talking about, but it could actually be more that they're trying to collect training information rather than.
Okay, so that they can.
They're not trying to verify that you know what a traffic light is, but they know that humans are really good at finding traffic lights.
But computers don't. Computers see a picture.
Yeah.
So it was 5 pictures in there, and is that a sidewalk? We didn't ask me, is this a sidewalk? Is that a sidewalk? All those things on there is what they're probably training. They have thousands of people that do that. And
Right. So, yeah. So the point here is that they'll be collecting. We'll always be collecting data, and we'll always be looking for new ways. So we're going to learn about some of those ways to do classification, and then, but we'll always have to do this process of verifying. Training a classifier, and then verifying whether or not that classifier is valid for this particular application. So that's always going to happen, I think, also for a very, very long time. So that's the process that we're gonna talk about. And to do that, I've uploaded some data here. This data is called the seagrass prediction.zip. It's in the seagrass prediction.zip shapefile. So that's the only thing that's here for the lecture so far. And I tried to work on a few other data sets, but that I might show later. Okay, so the goal here is that we have a data set, and we have some information, and we want to be able to train a classifier. First of all, we need to prep our data, our training data, train a classifier, run the classifier, and then check the results of that classification. So that process would work whether or not this is human data or whether or not this is environmental data. It's a process that needs to happen, okay, or that we need to learn about. All right, so to do that, I don't know why I have all that up. To do that, we need to first talk about our data sets that we have here. Okay, so what I want to do, the end goal here is I have all of the seagrass areas within the United States. Okay, I have all the seagrass areas growing in the United States. So there's seagrass, up here off of the coast of Cape Cod. There's seagrass growing down here. We know that there's seagrass. We go out there, we can see it. And seagrass growing here off of the coast of Texas. And there's some seagrass growing out here. Lots of it up in the Puget Sound area, and some down here by Sacramento. Okay. So we have these seagrass data sets. We have the seagrass data set for the United States. And what we want to do is categorize what areas grow seagrass and what areas don't. So we have these data sets. And so we know that seagrass only grows in nearshore areas. Seagrass is what? What type of organism is a seagrass? We all know it's a plant, right? It's a plant, and so plants rely on photosynthesis, and so plants require that the depth is a certain depth, right? You can't go, if you go below a certain depth, you don't get.
There's no oxygen going to be released from the grass.
And there's no sunlight.
No sunlight.
Yeah, and so that's really important to plants. So we know that there's depth that's necessary. They also require certain nutrients, and so this, if we look in, so we have this other data set. That's the seagrass data set. So I'm gonna turn that off. We have this other data set that has what we call these are called marine units. I forgot what ecological marine units, EMUs. So this is a global data set, and this global data set actually came attributed with some information already. So if I click on this point right here, I have all of this information: the temperature, the salinity. This is the average temperature, the average salinity, the
chemistry of it.
Yeah, and then I have some chemistry data, and then I also have what the depth is. Okay, so I have all that information already loaded into this data set. These are going to be the attributes that we use to predict whether or not seagrass can grow there or not grow there, because biologists have determined that these are the factors that are important for doing this. So right now we're using this for seagrass, but we could use this on land for predicting certain forest types. We would just need to come up with whatever variables we think would explain them, and they could be spatial variables. None of these explicitly are spatial variables, right? Like depth is, we have it spatially. So all this is geographic data, and we used it. We used some GIS tools to when I say we, I mean me and whoever else contributed to creating this data set, used to create that data set. But what I'm trying to say is we could also include, like, let's say that we thought that distance from the coast had some real reason to be included in there. My guess is it doesn't. It's just, you know, even if way out in the middle of the ocean, you had like a rise and it got shallow enough so the sunlight hit the seafloor, you could probably have seagrass growing there if the conditions were right, even if there was no land for thousands and thousands of miles. That's my guess. So anyway, that's not included. But if there was a reason to include some other distance variable, we would just need to make sure that it's in this data set.
Are those sample points, or they have to be sample points? Those dots, are they sample points for seagrass?
They were derived from, this is originally a raster data set. Oh, the sample, this isn't seagrass. The green areas are seagrass. The dots are the ecological marine units. So these were derived from a raster data set, from the center of a raster data set. So these were all raster data sets originally. But this is a vector class, so plus we're not doing very many of them. So I took all of them: temp, saliniture, app data, dis-002, nitrate. I took them all and combined them into one. In fact, I can do that a little bit later. That's what I'm actually running here. Let's see if this finished. Yeah. So I'm going to show you. I'll show you how I did that with a different data set. It looks like it's done, ready to go. So properties. Yeah. All right. So yeah, we can do that. But I was planning to show that one for a different type of classification. Use that example of doing that data classification. So we have all that data. These were all created from raster data sets. They were 90-meter grid cells that were turned into rasters. I mean, to vectors, to points, using the raster to point. Okay, so off track a little bit. Okay, so we think that these will help us determine whether or not seagrass can exist or not. Okay, and I know that seagrass will only exist in certain areas. So I actually took I only converted the dots that were in shallow areas. So these are all the shallow areas throughout the world, and here's the bathymetry shallow.
Well, what do you consider shallow? Is that
I forgot what depth I used, but it's a depth, a bathymetry depth.
Oh, okay.
So you can see there's no points outside. In fact, this depth is actually a little bit further out than what I used to create it, but yeah, it's just a certain depth. So actually, I can see what it is. So I just sort this ascending. It's going to be close to 11 meters down. Okay. What's that? Oh, I'm in the middle of my data.
So is that depth too low?
Oh, I think it was 20 is the cutoff that I used, actually.
Okay. So you say 20 to...
But these are all evenly spaced. I don't know why I don't have any exact 20s.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead. Maybe it was 18. I think I chose one and then I rounded it later, or changed it a little bit later to remove some. Okay, so we've got all those values, and then we have the U.S. coastline area, And these areas are very shallow. This is like the areas below. Let's see what I think this was the areas below 5 meters. Okay.
So is that below sea level then? Would it be based on the
It's a bathymetry layer. Yeah, it's just a bathymetry layer you can get on ARC GHY, the Living Atlas data set. So, like we talked about that a little bit last week, but here's Living Atlas, and if I just typed in bathymetry. Oops, I'm not spelling it right.
Water line down to whatever that you're talking about. So that changes down there. So it's the water.
Yes.
The top of the water to the deck, because that's what they do. Sunlight.
It is from some datum though. It's mean sea level of some. I don't know which datum that they used on us. We could look that up, but yes, it's not from the water surface all the time. It's from some.
Goes in and out, it changes, but
Exactly.
Based on
and to be honest, that's probably something that would help our model to predict better, is to have tidal information, because I'm sure that is part of what explains where seagrass is. Okay. All right. So in any case, we have all of our explanatory variables. Now we currently don't have a value that represents whether or not it's seagrass or not in this data set. This data set is the one that we're going to use to determine, or we're going to use to train the model. Okay. What are we going to do to train the model? Well, we're going to have to find out first. We're going to need to add an attribute that says whether or not it's seagrass or no seagrass. But we can't train the model outside of the continental United States. In other words, if I zoom in here to Alaska, I have no idea if this particular ecological marine unit is inside of a seagrass area or not. I just don't know, right? Because the seagrass data I have is only for the United States. I know the Alaska's in the United States. Sorry, it's only for the continental United States. So, I've been down to the Caribbean a lot. So if I go down here, I'm pretty sure that there's seagrass growing. Well, actually, here's U.S. Virgin Islands. Pretty sure there's seagrass growing in some of these areas, but I don't know for sure, because again, I chose another area in the United States. But it's the continental United States that we have data for. Okay. So what we need to do is, if we're going to do this, we need to have a column that represents that value. So to do that, we just simply add a value, and we could call it seagrass. And then we can specify.
it's going to be a string, right?
We could specify it as a string. So we'll go in here, especially since it's a classification. That would be a better way to do it. So we could say, we want it to be a text, and then we just save it. And the problem with using a string, you can use a string, but the problem with using a string is that you have to make sure that every entrance is exactly the same. That's pretty easy to do if you use calculate field. All right, so the question here is, if I want to ask the question, if I want to create seagrass or no seagrass in, did I just create it? Oh no, that's this one. If I want to create seagrass or no seagrass, first of all, I want to find all the dots that are within. Actually, I didn't need to create the seagrass yet, but it's fine that I did it now. First of all, I want to get all the dots that are within the U.S. coastline shallow. Okay. So how would I do that? How would I I select out only those points within within the shallow coastline area, because I don't want.
Well, it's almost like doing a calculation. So
Yeah, it's a select or an intersect. Those would both work. But what I want to do is I want to have a new data set that's only those that that are those areas. So let's do a select by location, and we're gonna do the what are the input features going to be? We're trying to find only the units that are within U.S. Coastline shallow.
What's all the options you got up there?
These are the 4 options.
Oh, just 4.
We're trying to find the ecological marine units within the U.S. coastline shallow.
Right. So was it 1?
Ecological marine units. The relationship can be intersect. That's fine.
Shallow.
U.S. coastline shallow. Yep. All right. So now I'm going to select by location creates a selection from that. So when it runs, I don't know why it's running so slow. When it runs, it's gonna highlight all of the ecological marine units that are within that distance. When it runs.
That's a lot of plots.
I don't know why. Yeah, this ran way faster on my desktop. I don't know why. My laptop's supposed to be pretty beefy. There we go. All right. So there are 86 of them selected. That's not a whole lot, but in ideal you'd want more. But that's how much we have to work with. Okay. So those are the 86 points that we selected. So this is going to constitute our training data. So we're going to see which ones were inside of seagrass and which ones were outside of seagrass areas. So let's take these 86 data points and make a new shapefile out of them. I did make it a little bit smaller so that it will run faster on examples. But these techniques actually work better and better when you have more and more data available, a bigger data set. Okay. All right, so let's take this data and export the features to a new data set. So we're gonna call it this. When you have a selection made, it operates on just the selection. So I can make my output feature class called near US EMU maybe. That's what I'm gonna call it. And then run. These are the areas where I know they're either seagrass or they're not. I know both of those. So another thing about all your training data is that you have to have a knowledge. You need to know the answer for all your training data. Now let's think about what's happening here when we're going to train it. We're going to train it on just this data, but then we're going to apply it to all of the data points in the rest of the world. Okay? So what are we assuming when we do that? Like as
we are come up with worldwide data.
Yeah.
We are assuming that it should. Well, we assume that it should grow in the rest of the world based on criteria if we can match up something.
Right. So we're assuming that in the rest of the world, the same criteria affect seagrass in the same way. So we're assuming that seagrass is seagrass. And there actually are different types of seagrass, different species of seagrass. And so that might be an invalid assumption. Okay? So if we were doing this for whatever we're doing it for, if we're doing it for forests or coral reef or, I was just on a call last week where we talked about doing this kind of thing for coral reef. But wherever we're doing it for, we need to make sure that it's portable out to the the outside area, because really, if we don't, we're extrapolating. So extrapolation is only safe when, so in here we're extrapolating spatially. Extrapolating is only safe if there's some biological or social, whatever you're predicting, reason that it should be safe.
When we're comparing things in the world currently, what each one have, and this you're talking about comparing depth, well, they got depth. So that's you assuming that there maybe some other factors.
Right. But what if in some areas, some of these chemicals that are dissolved in the water, the nitrates, the phosphorus, the silicates,
Well,
like maybe in some areas there's a species that is adapted to even more, or is adapted to less. That's what I'm talking about.
correct. And so that's thing is what you're doing is welding it down, and then you can start down. You got all this correct, but the chemistry, you might have to go back and test the chemistry.
Yeah, and that is one very good thing to recognize, is that sometimes the exercise of classification is a useful tool for analyzing a pattern, and it's sometimes even more interesting to then take your data, see if it works, and then wonder why it doesn't work in a certain area, because there's almost always a pattern to the areas that it didn't work, and that can actually help us to understand more about those areas it didn't work in. So yeah. All right, so here's our 86 points, which really technically are kind of just getting close to the edge of the number of acceptable points, especially for the technique that we're going to use. But we're gonna do them. And then here we have a column called seagrass, which this is really where I should have created it. So I got my seagrass column. How do I select out just the ones that are within the seagrass areas now? Because that's what I want. Do the same thing. That's exactly right. So we're going to go select by location, and our input feature now is going to be our near US EMUs, and our relationship will still be intersect, and the selecting feature now will be the seagrass, the USA seagrass areas. So I'm going to run this, and I will have again, to select from 86 features should be trivial task.
So
I wonder if something
it's going to output green area on top.
not working on my laptop. So yeah, basically right now it's finding out all the black dots that are inside the green area. That's what it's doing. And so, yeah, I mean, it didn't even run for a second. All right. So I'm not looking at the right table here. So if I look at the right table, so here is the table, and 53 of the 86 are selected. So that's a little over half. Oh, I totally forgot about something. There was another thing I was gonna just throw in as a cool new tool, and I needed to actually run it before I did that. So we'll actually rerun this. It's not hard. This will help you with something, because I'll show you how to run. I've actually already used the history tool. All right, you'll notice that I noticed it right here. In some of the data, there are missing values, right? So oftentimes, as data scientists, we have to account for missing values. Missing values in spatial data are not horrible, because we can take the values from the nearby neighbors and average them, okay? And there's a tool for doing that in ArcGIS. So there's a tool called Fill Missing Values. It's actually a pretty new tool. This whole space-time pattern mining tool is actually a pretty new toolbox in ArcGIS. So we've got the Fill Missing Values, and what we can do is take the data, and then we can fill missing values. So we'll just call this just going to shorten this to FMV for filled missing values. And these two sets are actually for the time information. And this isn't temporal data. We just have a snapshot. Well, it's not really a snapshot. It's averages. Oh, it's yearly average values are what all these represent. Okay, so we don't really need this location or time information. We're trying to fill in. Which fields are we trying to fill in? Well, we're trying to fill in all these fields that I mentioned before, the ones that look. So we need temperature.
So it's going to give a neighborhood average for those missing values?
It's going to look at it anytime there's a missing value. It's going to look at the neighbors. That's the way the tool works. We could actually look here and learn more about it. But so here is, with Polygon, it works with any type of data, but it fills it based on its neighbors. So there's actually a few different ways to do it. Salinity, that, dissolved, nitrate. These are all the values that we want to put in there. Nitrate, phosphate. That would be nice. There should be. We don't want every single one of them though.
Are these like the training values, or is not the training values?
These are the values that will be used to train it. Now, the depth, I'm pretty sure when I got the depth data, there weren't any missing values. Phosphate.
Yeah, because some may have a presence of something, and some may not have a presence of something.
Yeah.
And so you don't make them all.
But those all did. Yeah. See how the depth is. It's all there. I'm almost positive that there's no missing values in the depth, so we don't need to worry about that. We're only filling these other values up. And actually, I think temperature and salinity. These are data sets that I got from this. I showed HiCom data before in this class, or no?
I've heard of it.
Yeah. So HiCom data is collected by the U.S. government. I don't know why. Oh, that's because it's under people. I have to unselect people. That's why I couldn't get the bathymetry before, because there's no people bathymetry. But yeah, this HiCom data is kind of cool. ESRI publishes it because it's freely available data, and it's not classified. But they publish back 30 days and a forecast of what sea surface temperature is going to be like. It's 7 days, in the next 7 days.
Okay.
They call it a hindcast, but it's because it's really an interpolated data set. You're not looking at the raw data. They have floats out in the ocean that are measuring temperature and salinity everywhere, and they create these big raster data sets. You can look the last 30 days and 7 days in the future for those variables. And it's more than just temperature and salinity. It's also got temperature and salinity are the ones I pulled out, but it's got the wave height, and it's got the direction, the current direction where it's going, and a few other variables. So yeah, I actually don't need temperature because it'll run faster if I take out temperature and salinity, because we don't need to include those. So these are the only variables that I couldn't get everywhere. I don't know why the no data values existed, but they did. And so we're going to fill them with the average. In other words, the average of the four nearest, the nearest points. Okay. Temporal trend doesn't apply to us in this situation, but maximum would be the maximum of the neighbors. The median would be the middle value of the neighbors. The minimum would be the minimum, but average makes the most sense, I believe, here. And then, so here we can specify whether or not we want to specify all the neighbors within a specified distance, or if we just want the nearest neighbors.
It would take too much time, wouldn't it?
What's that?
Did you say, wouldn't that take more time to do the calculation?
If we wanted, we don't want to use all. We only want the nearest neighbor values. Well, we could do fixed difference. It would look at all of them, but only all of them within a certain distance. And then we could also get the spatial weights from file. I don't know if that applies here. So here, we really want the four nearest neighbors, because it's like It's a grid cell pattern. We could argue that you want the 8 nearest neighbors. I'm just going to go 4. So it'll just be the ones around us. All right, and then I'm going to run that. The ones immediately next to it. Going to run that, and I should have done this before. Then the output won't contain any of these null values. This part of the data has a ton of null values. There's not null values everywhere. there's less null values throughout the data, but I don't know why that one has so many. Okay. Yeah, maybe I should reboot or something.
Yeah, it is lagging.
It's going slow. It's not even like showing up this relatively small data set.
It should be in the black dots when you finish.
Well, the black dots. Yeah. Oh, it's just telling me that these areas, these are the new estimated areas. I ran them on the wrong data set. Second. So I was supposed to run that on the entire data set because we need that everywhere. So I'm just going to delete this because I don't even need it.
But the still missing value
Are you sure?
can still apply.
Yeah, because I did it on the FMV data set, which is the. So I.
No, that is the field. That's the one. That's your output. Field missing
Oh.
value.
But which data set did I run it on?
I think you ran it on
The global.
You-
Okay.
I think you're good.
Oh, I'm good. Never mind. I just saw that. Yeah, you're right.
So that's not the whole map.
Oh, but it only ran it on the selected ones. So all I need to do is clear the selection. And then run it again. See, this should be a global data set. This data set right here, the field missing values, because I need this on every data, on the entire data set. So I need this everywhere.
Oh, okay.
So now I need to run it again,
Yeah,
because I selected those out.
Yeah, there should be global.
Right. So there should be. So this is just telling me where it had to estimate the values and where it didn't have to estimate the values. That's what it's telling me.
So it only running on US data or on the world data?
It only ran it on the US data because there was still a selection on the world data.
Okay.
So remember, whenever you run a tool, if you have a selection on the layer that you're running it on, it'll not fail, but it won't.
It's just running on the selection.
It'll just run it on the selection, and that's really bad for our data because sometimes there was only one point in the, 1 point, and if it's only looking for its 4 nearest neighbors, that 1 point was also looking really far away, and it wasn't including maybe a phosphorus value that was right next to it.
Right.
So that's another reason why it was bad. So.
We just throw the numbers off because if you predicted all the average would be.
Well, it's not predicting as effectively as it could predict if it had every single data set in there. Okay. All right. So those are all the data. Now I'm going to change the symbol because we really don't need that information.
It's almost covering everything now because you don't put so many values that we commonly have all over the world.
Yeah, and I mean it should get the entire world. So we'll make this a little bit different color. Circle. Oh, those are too big. Properties. Size. 7. Make them green. Okay. So yeah, I mean, maybe I should have just started with this data set. But so this is the data set that I have where I created the values, and notice that it has these extra attribute fields that talk about how many of the values were estimated and so on. That's not information we're going to use in the model. So we could just, if you ever have fields that you just don't want to see, but you don't want to delete them, you can actually hide a field. So that's it's a little trick that we could do. All right, so don't need to do this for all of them.
Can you where you get those dots smaller, just to see maybe it's bleeding over and showing oversaturation.
Oh yeah, you want the dot smaller? Okay.
Rid of the differentiated dot.
I just re-symbolized them. I just went to symbology
Oh, okay.
over here. Okay, so unfortunately here, okay, so if we go to catalog, we go to history, I can rerun select by location, the first one that I ran, and just change this to underscore FMV. And then now it's gonna do that same selection. I don't need to change any of these other things. Oh, that's the seagrass one. I need to first select the USA one.
The shoreline.
Yeah, the USA, the close to USA. It's like a brand new laptop. I don't know why it's going so slow. All right. Actually, don't need that selection. All right. So let's just change this. EM near shore is what we want, and this one should be FMV. So now we're going to get just what's that?
Should we do it to the U.S. shallow? Because that's the near U.S. is the one we selected.
Yes, you're right. U.S. shallow coastline. All right, so we're just going to get only those areas that are near the that are near the U.S. coastline, exactly.
But this not a global one. After you run the U.S. one, then you can take it and make it globally. This one still put the patterns all over the world. So is it just running for the U.S. or it running for the whole world?
It's running for it's taking all the whole world data and it's selecting those that are
Like
no, it's select this one right now. We're just redoing that step where we're taking all of the points for the whole world and we're selecting just those that are near shore to the U.S. Because our goal here is to make everything be is to give examples of seagrass and no seagrass. So let's finally start. Like it doesn't even start running for a little while. Okay, so that's that, and then we need to export. I guess that doesn't show up as a previous package. So right click, data, export features. So we're going to take this data set and export it out to a new data set. And this one is going to be called 90 slash this one's this one near US. So we're recreating that one near US underscore emu. All right.
We'll override the other one.
Okay. Oh yeah. Sorry, that goes right here. I don't know why some tools have you put the name on a separate line. So this is the location. That's the name. We're all set. So it's going to export that one, and then as soon as we do this, we'll be back to what the step we were just about to do, which was take the column and say whether or not it was seagrass or not in the column. So I think the easiest way to do that is if we're going to use text, and I think it's a good thing, it's okay to use text. What we need to do is first say everything is not seagrass, and then select the areas that are seagrass and redo the column. That way we'll type it all up correctly. Okay. So
this run, that's going to create a layer with just that blue, and then after that there, you're going to attach that onto seagrass.
yeah, so this. It's not even like showing up when I turn a really small layer on and off.
That's crazy. I've never seen you like that running.
Well, y'all did type the numbers up. It's going through.
Okay, I called this seagrass projection project. Like save as it doesn't even show up.
Okay, you finally loaded.
Ridiculous.
You might be able to save now.
Okay. All right. So I'm gonna turn.
So you don't have any null values now, right? No value.
I don't have any null values, but I did that on the last step. The step I just did was copying the data over to copying just the areas within near shore. That was from last night. I don't know, maybe it'll help if I close. That looks like it's like freaking out.
So you're gonna associate the near shore to seagrass then? And take one of that off.
It might be that one. 'Cause that's a big old raster.
Yeah. But it's done processing, and I just created it earlier. But, you know, I'll close. All right. Computer's not working. That's disturbing. It's saving. Yeah, saving now. Yeah, click. All right. Yeah, that's not even closing. All right. So now these are all the points that are within a certain distance of the U.S. shoreline, or within a certain depth of the U.S. shoreline. So now I need to decide which ones of these are seagrass and which ones aren't. And I could do that, again, by doing the same thing as we did before. I have, did I get rid of my field? My seagrass field?
If that's saying some have phosphate and some don't, should the numbers be zero?
What's that?
I saw when I saw the chemistry and chemistry had zero. I wanted to.
Right. Let's see if this will run. Okay, so actually, one thing that that's with everything. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, we need to add a new field that says whether or not it's seagrass or not. Okay. Yeah. Well, what happened was it only output the new fields.
Oh, the ones that we calculated.
The ones that we tried to fill. Okay. So, yeah.
So I think they got rid of our salinity and stuff too, right?
Yeah, it does actually. Let's see how fast this is running now. Because, all right. So we actually want temp. I thought I was going to make it go faster, but we actually want temperature and salinity and depth in here. We need those in order for this to work, because those are all the fields that we need. So I'm just gonna rerun that. If this takes a long time, then we should probably just reboot my computer.
So when you output the file, you didn't take that data with you to form a new file. It only just left some of the information out when you did the output. That's the reason why it left.
It only took the fields that I specified, and I tried, by trying to save time, I tried to include not as many fields. So when I worked through this example before, but my computer was running slow, so I left out temperature and salinity and the depth fields. But I put them in there before because I knew they didn't have any missing values. And so when I ran it, everything worked fine. So, all right. So now I should have all the information that I need. If I open up, I'm not going to worry about resymbolizing this. I'll just turn it off for now. But yeah, when I right now I'll run my select by location again and select just those in the U.S. Right, not uncommon in
You did the U.S. shallow, right?
right U.S. shallow coastline. Those are the same, so I just need to rerun it, and now I'll have that, and then I need to rerun the near shore, and I'll finally have the data that I need. I did this on my desktop, but maybe I should have just had like a cooking show. Here's the. You ever watch
Looking for a cake already done.
what's that?
She was showing the cake already done.
Right. You put it in the oven and you pull it out, and this is it. Yeah.
And we're gonna do with that select. We're gonna export that later, right?
Yep. Yes, that's exactly what we're going to do. So, yeah, I mean, I've already talked about most of this. Okay, so now we've got just those selected areas, and we need to export those. Now, this is the third time we've done it, so we export those to near underscore US, no, just US underscore EMU. We'll write over that other one and run it. So we have all of the near shore, regardless of whether they're seagrass or not. This represents our training data set. And to make it truly a training data set, we need to give it that field that has the information to train on. Okay? And that's what we're going to do next.
So it's going to bring everything with it to be paired up with seagrass. You're not going to leave it out this time. It's just going to do, when you do this process of exporting, it's going to export it with all the other information.
Well, yes. So now that this is the third time we've run it. So the first time I forgot to fill the data. The second time, when I filled the data, I tried to save time. So I left out some of the variables. And finally, I have all of them. So this represents our training data set. It looks like it's not quite done running. It's still going to have 86 points. And it's going to have the points filled up with the time data and so on. As soon as this. Yeah. I wonder if there's some like task that's. It says it's all ArcGIS Pro. It's having the. I mean, that's using so much of the memory.
Is that 43 Chrome windows?
So yeah, it's a lot of Chrome windows. I should probably close, but I don't know. I don't think that's a problem, but maybe it is. Okay, too many Chrome windows. Okay, so yeah, we're gonna open up an attribute. All right, so we still need to add the field back, and the field is going to be called seagrass. And then I'm going to pick a name for. I'm going to make it text. And then say save. And then I can go back to here and we can calculate. So first, I think the easiest way to do this, like I said, is to right click on seagrass and calculate the field and say that everything is, why don't we just, what do you want to say, Elvis? You think we should say no or yes?
Yeah, I was thinking about telling you yes or no.
Yeah, okay, so no seagrass. We'll just say no. I think we have to put it in quotes and run it.
Like single quote to go.
Let's see. Sometimes it doesn't matter in Python. I mean, I think this is fed into a Python code, and so I'm pretty sure it doesn't matter. I put single quotes.
Okay.
So no actually means no seagrass. There'll be someone there that says yes.
Yes, so that's what we're going to do here in a second. So as soon as this runs, they'll all say no.
And then we'll change it based on
Yeah.
the
So we're just doing that so we don't have to do it in 3 steps. So if we did yes, if we selected and said yes, then we have to select again and say no.
Okay.
But now we don't have to run 2 selections. We have to run 1 selection. So now we need to go back and do a select by location. Select by location. And we're going to select our nearshore EMUs, near US EMUs, and the selecting feature is going to be the seagrass. And then we're going to say OK. And so now we're going to we'll get selected here just those seagrass, just those EMUs that are nearshore and our seagrass. So this will form our training data set. Because the only places where we knew seagrass could occur is nearshore U.S. Those are the only areas where our EMUs, we knew that the ones that weren't seagrass really weren't seagrass.
So we can infer this data worldwide
Mm-hmm.
based on knowing that this information is correct.
That's exactly what we're going to do. So we're going to take our 53, we're going to calculate field, and now it'll only apply it to the selected ones. So we could say seagrass, quote, yes, quote, and we'll have that. And we've prepared our training data set. And we could use, actually, there's all sorts of classification algorithms out there, and some of them are meant to run, like some of them take what we'd call raster data. They take imagery and turn them. So you've probably heard terms like maximum likelihood calculator classifiers, nearest neighbor classifiers. Basically, what they're doing is they're taking all of the data that's in here and they're putting it in n-dimensional space. So now it's done. So if you could think, if there was only 3 columns that we were going to classify on, like let's say there was just temperature, salinity, and depth. If those were the only 3 we were going to do, you could create a 3-dimensional scatter plot. So you could put, for every value, you could put temperature, precipitation, and its temperature, its precipitation, and its depth. And then you could color the dots as they existed in that 3-dimensional space. You could color them either red for yes, or maybe let's do green for yes and black for no. And if you noticed that in 3-dimensional space, that there was a cluster up here and a cluster down here, you could define this box in 3-dimensional space is going to be no, and this box in 3-dimensional space is going to be yes, right? That's kind of the simplest classification method, and usually we refer to that as something like nearest neighbor or parallelepiped. You might have heard classification. We're just making a box in 3-dimensional space around that cluster of yeses and nos, right? Now, how do you know if the classification is going to be bad? Well, if in 3-dimensional space you could see that there are some points that are up in this box that should be down in this box, the classification isn't going to work really well if there's overlap.
So the title of the group, classification is
the tighter the group, the better the classification method's going to work. No matter what method you use. Okay. So if we're just talking about their box in space, we can do that. Well, maximum likelihood technically looks at the 3-dimensional distribution in space. And if you look at a distribution, I'll just pull up, like, what is a distribution? Distribution. Yeah. All right. So that's a simple distribution. So in 2-dimensional space, or 1-dimensional space, I guess technically, this could just represent, let's just say this represented phosphorus, right, along the x-axis here. One of the variables we're going to use. This represents phosphorus, and all the seagrass existed in this part, and all the no seagrasses existed in that part. Well, then we could just classify it by drawing a line between those two, right? But what happens if in 3-dimensional space, some of these have seagrass and some of them don't? It's probably more likely that we get seagrass like right in the middle of the distribution and falls off as you go away. Okay, but you still have some seagrass out here. Most of the seagrass, it likes the phosphorus, let's say, or the nitrate. Okay, it needs to have that. and it drops off at a certain point. Well, if we get the distribution of all of the variables, we can the maximum likelihood says, okay, well, which one is it most likely to fall in based on the distribution of the based on its distribution. So if you can overlay the distributions, you could say which, like maybe like this, like one represents the distribution of phosphorus values for seagrass, and this one represents the distribution of phosphorus values for not seagrass. And our point might end up right here. Well, it looks like it's more likely that it's not seagrass than it's seagrass.
You do a histogram on that inside of the data that's ran on GIS.
Yeah, you can do a histogram.
And then kind of show you where your numbers could be 22.
Right, yeah, like right now, like I can actually do some data preparation. I think that it would. I mean, not data exploration. It might be better to do this in some other program, but I can chart the values for what I was just talking about. So where is the nitrate? Let's do. Statistics. I'm pretty sure this will just give it to me for. Okay, so this is just the ones the selected are just those that are seagrass because I have seagrass selected. So those are the yeses. And so you'll notice that at least there is, if you look at just the high values of nitrate, so these are the lowest values of nitrate. These are the lowest values of nitrates. There are many more that are seagrass than there aren't. Okay, and as you get out, that relationship doesn't look like it changes that much. But at some point, there are very few nitrate values, and there are a little bit more. Very few seagrasses, and there are more not seagrasses. So it'd be hard to draw a line with just this one. We couldn't draw a line with just this one. If you did want to draw a line, it might be right around here. You'd still get some error. Okay? But hopefully, when whatever algorithm we're using is seeing lots of the data, then it can find a pattern that actually helps. Okay? That helps make a clear distinction between the two.
Staying in that symbology, in the symbology portion.
In the charts?
Yes, you can put it up in the chart too. You can do a symbology on that particular thing. And you know how you're trying to find the classification? Just do a symbology on night. Can you symbolize that on the, when you got it on the map? I don't know. It's not going to be in the chart. It's going to probably be on it's going to probably be on seagrass itself. Whatever point you came up with. And once you go in there, you have a history of them. You have all those different things on there. But it doesn't individualize those items. I understand. I was thinking about something.
Okay.
So you are in the actual chart, so you at the minute level. But I was thinking about that.
Yeah. So now we've got this is going to be our training data set. We've got our near US EMU's data, and that's going to be our training data set that we're going to use to run a classifier. ArcGIS, we could export it and run it in, like I like to use Python to do classification. Python's got tools for doing neural networks, for doing deep learning, which is really just networks of neural networks. That really doesn't apply to this particular data set. It's not big enough to do really that type of data with. But the same principles apply. You need to prepare your learning data set, which is what we've done, and it needs to have all the fields that you think are the predictive fields, and then it needs to have the answer. Otherwise, if it doesn't have the answer, then there's nothing for the algorithm to choose, to pick, to decide.
So what is the answer? The new US EMU?
No, the answer is the yes or no,
Oh,
seagrass.
yes or no, okay.
We're trying to figure out whether it has seagrass or not. That's what we're trying to do.
Okay.
So, so now they have an algorithm that they've implemented called forest-based classification and regression. This is a algorithm that it's considered a machine learning algorithm for predicting values, and it's based on the principle of regression. What it does is it takes small samples of your data. So in our case, let's say we have 1,000 points, but we don't. Well, we have 100, or we have 86. So it takes small portions of your data and tries to come up with a regression equation, a mathematical equation that's going to predict. In this case, it would be, with a yes-no question, it's going to be the likelihood of it being seagrass or not seagrass. So we could do that with just one regression equation, right? But let's say that we don't have that just one regression equation is going to be more affected by the particular training data that we have. And if we have a really large data set, what it can do is build multiple regression equations with subsets of the data. So in other words, it took subset data A, subset of data B, subset of data C, and it goes through and it tries to make a decision using subset A versus subset B versus subset D versus subset E. It has a bunch of subsets of the data, and it tries to come up with an equation for each subset of the data. And then what it does is when it gets a new example, when you train it, when you get the result, it takes your data and it runs it through every single classification, okay? And then it finds out which one it got the majority of the time. So in other words, if I got the right answer, if I got seagrass, 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 and no seagrass, it chooses seagrass. Or if I got no seagrass, no seagrass, 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 it chooses no seagrass because it ran it 5 times and it got no seagrass 3 times. Okay, and it's been shown through literature that that is better than just doing it once. Okay, it works out better than just doing it once. So people have studied this sort of thing. The reason it's called a random so the original algorithm was called the random forest algorithm. The guy that published the random forest algorithm was, I think, if I remember correctly, he copyrighted the term. So although it's a pretty straightforward, easy to understand thing for a mathematician, and you can implement it, ESRI can't say we're using this. So that's what they mean. It's an adaptation of Leo Bremen's random forest algorithm. And by random, it means that we take a random sample of the training data and create multiple answers, and then we average across the answers if we're using actual regression. But if we're doing classification, we just take the highest, the majority. It's average if it's like in other words, if each of these regression equations produced a number like 16, 18, 17, 14, then we take the average of all those to give the answer. That's why it works for classification and regression. So this works for both. So it can work for classification and it can work for regression. All right, and really most machine learning algorithms, you actually want it to have way more examples than we have, but we're going to run it so that it'll run fast. But so here's an example of some data. They have some point data that might represent temperatures. They have some county data that might represent some socioeconomic variable, and this looks like it's distance from something. So you can put whatever data you've got, you can put it in here. It just needs to be in this format that I've created that has the columns are these predictive are the things that we're using to predict. Then you need to have a column that gives it the answer, whether it's seagrass or not, or you could just be trying to like locate the true south or something. Like you could be a regional geographer and be trying to define a region, and you could go ask like hundreds of people. What's that?
Like if restaurants offer sweet tea or not.
Well, what you could do is because you need to have an answer. So you could go ask hundreds of people to kind of like draw a polygon, and then come up with a polygon that most people chose, and then you could you could just feed it a bunch of variables, and then run it and see if the polygon that it created is pretty similar to what you came up with. And then you could say these variables do predict pretty well what people say is the south. Yeah.
So which one is more accurate? What the average of what people say or what the computer says? Is the computer trying to compare and say we got the same answer? Or can the computer answer be better than what we all chose as a group?
Well, okay, so let's say with this particular thing, you need to feed it the answer. Like it learns from what the answer is.
You can't be just figuring out something from scratch. You have to have some other things that are like, this was here first. You can base it off.
There are tools for just finding cluster. Like when I say cluster, I don't mean the way we used it earlier, which was like grouping hotspots almost. And I actually did want to get to that point today. So let's just say we have a bunch of data and we want to find out. So we want to group it into things that are similar. So in other words, we could feed it income. And like health statistics, and just feed it in there, and it might find areas, and it'll tell you what those average areas are, the averages for those areas. We'll talk about that today. We'll take the county health data and we'll run those tools on that. Okay. All right, so this is the ability to. This is running it, and what we need to do is feed it the training data, which is the near IMUs. The variable that we want to predict is the seagrass variable. That's the variable that we want it to predict in the end. And then we need to say the explanatory training variable. These are the variables that we're going to explain what they are. Now, if you can feed it, like in this example, you can feed it a distance layer, but ArcGIS will actually calculate that distance for you if you want to. If you want to just say, okay, this is a feature that I think will explain. Like if we wanted to put shoreline right here, that was the example I gave earlier. If we wanted to put shoreline here under explanatory distance features, it would go ahead and calculate the distance to shoreline for us. But it had the same effect as putting it in the model manually, like calculating that value and then putting it in there later. So we could run the near tool to figure that out, but the code's already in there. Okay. So. So those are the training features. Yeah, output trained features. All right, yeah. Let me go look at this tool. That, yeah, it doesn't work on multi-part data. It also doesn't work on lines. All right, so let's run this first, and look at the outputs here. So I'm going to run it. this takes a little while. I might as well just take the break right here.
So right now you are running the training data with the forest based.
Oh, I forgot to put in the. I got distracted. I distracted myself. I forgot to put in all the variables that it needs. Otherwise, it's.
Well,
So,
aren't they taking it from the training data that you created? Or you gotta just go back and put it back in there?
No, your computer's freaked out.
Yeah, I don't know. Okay, so.
Filled or estimated? That's what I was gonna ask.
Yeah, it didn't run. Well, so let's look at the data here. So here's the temperature filled. There's also an estimated.
Each one has 3 now. I think it has
Oh,
the original filled.
the estimated field is it just tells you how many times that had to be estimated.
Oh, okay.
Well, no, sorry. It tells you a 1 or a 0 whether or not it was estimated.
Like a yes or no.
Yes or no, exactly. And so you could circle a region and count how many were estimated and how many weren't estimated. So what that's
more
for.
like an accuracy assessment if you were trying to do something like that.
Right. So we want to use all the filled values. The filled means the values that we want to have. So we want all of the values that say filled all the way down. We don't want the standard deviation or the reason why I report standard deviation is because you could use that to determine something about your estimate. Because really, if it's filled, they're estimates. And so if the standard deviation is really high, what it means is that your neighbors might not be as good of a predictor because they're really different from each other. Okay, so filled. Oops, did that one twice. So yeah, you stick in all of your values, nitrate. Am I getting in them all? Got nitrate. Whoops. I think there's 5 of them, and then there's the temperature.
So it's going to run all the scenarios with those things that you were putting in there, so it can come up with.
I got 9.
Values.
You got 9.
9.
Okay. All right. So what's after nitrate?
The percent CO2.
Okay. What's that one? Next one.
Phosphate.
Phosphate filled. What's the next one?
Ciliate.
Cycate filled.
And then you got your temp. So depth is not filled.
Temp. Yeah, so temperature was unfilled.
Because it was already.
Yeah, it was already filled, and so was all the other ones were all unfilled.
Mm-hmm.
Salinity, depth. Okay. Yeah. So let's just run it the way. Oh well, here. So here's the advanced forest options. So what this is going to do, we do actually need to fix this to set these things, especially for our smaller data size. The most important things here are the number of trees and the number of number of data available per tree. And technically, you never want that to be 100%. But my guess is that this does change depending on your data. So my guess is ESRI sets a default value based on how many values you have. And so we've had so few values that it automatically hits 100%. So let's actually change this to be 90%. So every time it runs, it'll use 90% of the data. So we really don't need 100 trees because 90% of the data, if we're using 90% of the data for each time it makes a decision tree, so what it calls the decision. If we make 100 different trees, which means it's running 100 different times, and we're using 90% of the data each time, on average, we're going to already get all the data pretty quickly. Like there are going to be a couple of trees that are using probably the same data because we're basically taking a sample of 90% of 86. And so at some point, if we run it 100 times, that sample is going to make duplicates. So we really only need let's say 20 trees.
So that's just like 100 scenarios.
Yeah, it's 100.
You already done found out the answer back and you're still running.
Yeah. So we're just going to run it 20 times, and it's going to get to see 90% of the data. But it's better if you have. It's more ideal. You should have a large chunk of the data, and so you should have at least, at least 30, but more ideally a couple hundred samples in each data set. So in each iteration, you should have that many. Okay. All right. So we're gonna. Oh, did I talk about this? Needs to be say. If you want to basically make the output categorical, that needs to be checked. And the reason that needs to be checked is, so when I ran this myself on my desktop, I made seagrass a number, and I made it 1 or 0. And I still needed to check that box. Otherwise, it would have tried to predict a number between 1 and 0 all the time, because it would assume that my output was not categorical. Okay. So if your data should be categorical, in other words, it should fall into one of the categories, that needs to be checked. Okay.
You check down the side of our variables and then you check, right?
Yes. Now here, the training data excluded for validation is it's going to run one test at the end where it holds out 10% of the data and rechecks to see how well it did. Okay. So we'll have an estimate of that. Now this is actually not the same as, it's not exactly the same. It's still important, but in the end you should also have some data that you withhold that's in a totally different area to check your validation. But this validation data is going to be withheld from these data sets, and we'll see how accurate it is when withheld from that data. All right, so I'm going to run it, and
what's for the output? Is they gonna,
see, it might take forever.
are they gonna
It shouldn't take forever.
Are they gonna output something so that we can visually see it, or just gonna come up?
Yeah, it'll give us a report too.
So this is the AI asking us for data.
Asking us for data. Yeah. Okay. So there's going to probably be some warnings related to the size of the data set. Okay. We didn't actually ask it for any distances, so it's warning us. This warning doesn't really apply to us, but if we had checked use distances from something, it's warning us that our data isn't projected. And I talked about that before several times. If you do geographic analysis and you're including distances or directions in areas, you need to make sure your data is projected correctly. Okay, so this is the output of what we created. So we specified there's going to be 20. It's going to have, by default, it shows a leaf size. In other words, how many different inside of the model, how many different choices that it had to make at the end. And this was a very simple one that just had seagrass or no seagrass, so it's just one.
Should it be predicting differently on different computers? Or should it be predicting the same?
It should be predicting, well.
It's similar, but it's not the same.
Yes.
That's what I got.
So if they're truly random, which sometimes, so that computers aren't actually good at doing randomness, right?
Yeah, they like that pattern.
Yeah, so if you ask a computer to generate a random number, there's no way to really code that in. There's no way to code in basic, because we're just talking about ones and zeros, right? So what they do to simulate that is that they have random number tables, and those random number tables are drawn from the time that it is. So what you ask for a random number, what it does is it figures out what time it is, and it draws that from a specific random number table that was actually generated by a human at some point through pulling numbers out of a hat. So it picks a random number table based on a time. And so there's always a random number table associated with a particular time. And so, so it is possible, since this is a random forest, in other words, it's running this multiple times through the data, that, but the random, what I'm trying to get at is the randomness that it chose is based on time. And so your 90% of the data was different than my 90% of the data, because it chose a different random set of the data. If we had if we'd run it at the exact same computer time for both of our computers, it is possible to get the same exact answer, but it's not likely.
Oh, okay.
It should be that you run it at a certain time and you get.
But you're not comparing the total accuracy of randomness, or you just want to come up with a random number that we might be in the ballpark of each other because our time, since we're in the same area, close but not exact.
Right, right. So down here, you've got, when you scroll down, this has most of the information that's kind of like the output information that decides whether or not this was a good model, and it also tells you about which things are most important. So these show up as the variables that made the most important decisions when it ran. It's called a decision tree because there's basically it slices your data up and decides, oh, if a value is higher than this, it's most likely seagrass, or a value is lower than this, it's most likely not seagrass. So this was involved in like 15% of the decisions that it made. The decision trees that were, so there's 20 decision trees. So this was involved in 15% of them. So actually, this is pretty good in terms of all of these values. All these values were used at least some time. Okay, so we have a lot of these values, and the importance is of 50.53. It ranges from 0 to 1, by the way, and so none of these are super important, but none of them are super low either. So they all had influence on the indecision. So it wasn't like any of the variables need to be thrown out. Now, with the decision tree, it's pretty robust in terms of how well it can deal with data that's not important. Like all classification. So another thing about classification schemes is that one of the dangers that you face is what's called overfitting. In other words, the classification method, the algorithm that you use, learns everything so well that it's basically just memorizing your data. In other words, it decides this is definitely what a seagrass area looks like, and this is definitely not what a seagrass area looks like. If you gave it like so many training sets and you let it look at so many different versions of your data, that's why you want to hold some of it back. You'll know that if it overfit, if this value is way different than this value. That's one of the problems, is if it overfit. Or you'll also know that if it's just not working. Like if this accuracy is really high, and this accuracy, which is the classification diagnostic, the validation value, if this value is really low and this value is really high, it's overfit. In other words, it's only memorized your data and doesn't have the ability to apply it to any other.
What's a big difference? Like what?
This is getting close to a big difference.
So mine being, my top one's 0.99 like y'all's are. Or yours is, and my bottom one's 0.62.
It's 0.62. Yeah, that's way too big.
Okay.
Yeah, that
Or
means
it should be near 0. It should be near 0.
the difference should be close to 0.
So even that's
In my case, this is kind of getting on the edge. If both of these are over 90%, that's pretty good, right? But really, we're using the same data.
I know.
And the reason why you can get one that's 60 and I can get one that's 80 is because we are not using a big enough data set, right? So
it really matters how you pick it.
10% of 86 is only how many points? It's only 8.6 points, so it's probably only 9 points. And so it's checking the accuracy of just 9 points. And so if we had 900 points, it might be better. Okay, so yeah, that's the accuracy. This is the accuracy on your validation data, and those need to be pretty close. And like I said, if this one is way lower,
So
then
they should have the same number.
it overfit.
So
Now, if they're both low, then what do you think that means? If this is low and that's low, what do you think that means?
Missing variables?
Yeah, I mean, it could be that you're missing variables. Yeah, either it definitely means that the variables that you have don't do a very good job at predicting what you're trying to make it
Either
predict.
they're wrong or there's not enough.
Right.
So is there a right answer? So the right answer to accuracy, is there an accuracy number you should have? That 0.99, are you trying to get to 1% accuracy? The other one is 0.62.
Well, most of these machine learning algorithms, if you give them enough data, the accuracy will always be high. It will never not be high.
Okay.
Because you're looking at your data in so many different ways. And so they can get to be a very, very high value. And so this will almost always be in the 90s if you give it enough training data.
That's good.
Right.
It's 90% accurate.
Right. But the thing is that
That needs to be named.
yeah, that needs to be safe. So yes. So the two things that can happen are if the validation is way lower than this, what that means is that it tried to find patterns in your data and it found some really good patterns in your data, but those patterns don't apply universally. Those are just kind of like mistakes. Like, I mean, I guess it would be.
Is there a difference
Or only
between
true for
one?
that area.
Yeah, only true for that
If
area.
you do the math to say, okay, this says 90, this says 60, so that's 30% different from the other one. 90, 60.
Yeah.
That's a big gap.
That's a big difference.
You want the difference to be as close like that. as
Right.
possible.
And if it is, what that means is that data that it withheld has those same patterns that it's in the real data. If they're really close, that's what it means. If they're really different, it means that data that you withheld
Right.
doesn't have those same patterns, right? And it's actually not that much different than like the way that we learn, and that's why it's compared to that, and the biases that we create by learning. So if we show up for a bus, and every day that bus is 10 minutes late, we might start showing up 10 minutes late, and if we still keep getting on the bus, we're happy. And then we might decide, hey, when I go somewhere else, I might show up 10 minutes late. Oh, the bus already left. That's like a bias that I built in. Oh, the buses are always late.
But see, it's not really telling the story because there's so many variables to what the data is. So the one you're stating is based on why it's 9% accurate, and the one that the computer comes back and do says it don't tell you what particular thing influenced. Is that?
That's what this is trying to communicate. Is that dissolved oxygen was of these, it was the most important.
Okay.
Phosphate was pretty important. So this is the level of importance. This is the number of times it used that variable to make the decision, or the percentage of times that it used that to make the decision. So this is the percentage of times it used to make the decision, and then this is how important on a scale of 0 to 1 that it is to the overall model.
Is this what you're stating, or that's what the computer said?
That's what the computer said.
Okay, so the one that below that with the validation model just running it so many times to say, no, I don't think that's correct. Is that what it's saying? The validation data?
Yes.
Is that saying that I don't think that first one is correct?
No, what happens is it took our 86 points and it took out 9 of them.
Oh.
And those because we said 10%. It took out 10% of those and it hid them from the computer. And it said, I'm going to hide these from you. And then we did the classification and regression algorithm, the forest-based thing, and it got a model. And then I said, surprise! Now do these 10 through the existing model, and it got basically mine got 8 out of 9 correct, and yours got 6 out of 9 correct. and that's why, or 5. Hers got 5 out of 9 to get 66%. Yeah. So that's what that means.
But what action do you take from that? What would be the action from looking at those two things?
Well, the action. Well, if in our case, honestly, the action would be to get more data, right? Because there's a difference between our two answers. So we'd want to run it enough that we actually got the real answer. But if, let's say we did have 1,000 points, and this did represent actually 80%, or in her case, if that represented 10% of the data being withheld, then yes, in her case, the model doesn't work very well. And so what you need to do is an overfit, because if this is still high and that's low, then there's overfitting that happened. And so what you need to do is actually give it less data and see if you can get those close together. Okay, it's not likely that you're actually going to bring this up, but you're going to get this to be.
So it's overcompensating for something that's met that don't need to be there.
Yeah. In other words, the same thing is true. Is you don't have the right answers for your data. All right.
Is this called? This is how you said the computer, the AI system. They kind of basically do this, but on a larger scale.
Right. Right. Okay. So so we only have these yes/no classes. So this is just a summary of the values. So in the training data, this was the minimum dissolved oxygen was 4.30. The maximum dissolved oxygen was 6.98. Okay. And then in the validation data, it was pretty similar. So that's actually good. So if the data was truly random and you had a ton of data, these should all be similar. So you should be looking down these and making sure that the minimum and maximum in the training data was similar to the validation data. So that's what that's doing. Here is the percentage of overlap between the ranges of the training data and the input explanatory variables. So you can actually see that if these So what this is doing is it's doing that for you, that comparison. So if all these should be 1, and if any of these are significantly less than 1, then the range doesn't overlap the same as the other range. So this says that the range here only comprises 62% of the range over there. So I should be doing this on the computer, but I was getting antsy. So this range from 1 to 17 and this range from 2 to 12, what this is doing is saying that the validation data only comprises 62% of that range. So 2 to 12 is the difference is 10, 1 to 17 the difference is 16. So if you put those in an equation, the top and the bottom, you get 62%. That's what that's saying. So it's the percentage of overlap. All right. So if those values are really low, that's a problem. And what it's doing is saying anything that, in this case, it's even calling this a problem, being 84%. So if you did have thousands and thousands of records, on average, you should actually see those values be very, very similar. Okay, so that's what that's telling you. And that's another reason to put out that warning. All right. Okay. Now we didn't actually run this on the whole thing. Okay, that's the next step. That's what you do on the next step. But the problem is, the reason why I didn't do it is that the problem is that your data needs to contain all of these same fields. So I think what we'll do is we'll take a break, and I'll really quickly make sure that my other data has that information, and then we can run it really quickly on that. So let's come back at 1:40, and I'll do that, and then we'll do an example of what if you want to explore data. like you were saying before, come up with categories. We'll do an example on that. Yeah, probably.
That's like every time I hear you going over something new, I'm like, wait, how can
I can do that. Yeah.
Yep.
All right, let me pause the video here. Do this. Stop.